The transport truck wheezed to a stop at Camp Ridgeline's gate, 8,000 feet up in the Colorado Rockies. This wasn't the kind of place you requested assignment to. You were sent here for punishment or precision. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez stepped down from the vehicle, her boots hitting gravel that crunched with yesterday's ice. Maybe 40, maybe older. She wore an outdated parka with no unit patches visible. Just her name stitched in faded thread on fatigues that looked like they'd been pressed in a supply closet somewhere. To the hard-eyed 20-somethings near the equipment shed, she looked exactly like what she appeared to be, someone's administrative. Mistake. Must have sent the supply lady by accident, muttered Private Jackson loudly enough for half the formation to hear. He had the kind of easy confidence that came from never being truly tested. The sort of swagger that looked good until it met something that didn't care how tough you thought you were. The others snickered around him. These were Rangers and Marines, special operations candidates with combat tours and tribal tattoos, men who'd learned to measure worth in blood and bullets. They looked at Rebecca's clean uniform and careful movements, and saw exactly what they expected. Someone who belonged behind a desk. Not on a mountain where survival mattered more than paperwork. Rebecca signed her gear roster with handwriting that was precise and economical. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourishes. When the duty sergeant handed her a barracks assignment, she nodded once and shouldered her duffel with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she'd done this before in places where efficiency mattered more than style. The first week passed like watching someone fail in slow motion. During rope climbs, she struggled for 4 long minutes while others finished in 30 seconds. On ruck runs, she came in dead last, 12 minutes behind the next slowest candidate. She wheezed into formation while others were already drinking water and checking their phones. That night, the jokes started in earnest. Clipboard became her nickname. Sticky notes appeared on her locker with helpful suggestions about finding desk jobs in safer locations. She peeled them off methodically, folded them with the same precision she brought to everything else, and placed them in a green notebook she kept beside her cot. By week 2, the pattern had crystallized into something approaching ritual. Weapons. Disassembly, dead last, but with every component properly cleaned. Navigation exercise. Last to finish, but with all 5 markers correctly identified, while others had missed crucial waypoints in their rush to complete the course quickly. Why? Did they send a paper pusher to Ridgeline? Corporal Anderson muttered to the senior instructor after another dismal performance review. We're trying to sharpen razors here, not babysit staplers. But Rebecca kept showing up. Every morning, boots tied perfectly, weapon spotless, ready for whatever fresh humiliation the mountain offered. There was something unsettling about her. Persistence, the way she absorbed punishment without complaint or explanation. It was the kind of quiet dignity that made some people uncomfortable, because dignity under pressure was supposed to be earned through visible achievement. Week 3 brought brutal cold that turned morning exercises into survival challenges. During sprints up an icy trail that had claimed several ankles already, Rebecca stumbled hard and went down on the rocky path. When she got up, Private Brooks noticed the blood, a thin trickle from her mouth where she'd bitten her tongue on. Impact. She wiped it away like it was nothing more than sweat and kept climbing. No dramatics, no requests for medical attention, just the same methodical progress up a hill that was defeating soldiers half her age. That night in the barracks, theories multiplied like rumors in a small town. She's faking it, Jackson declared, with the authority of someone who'd figured out the angle everyone else had missed. Working toward a medical discharge before she washes out normally. Probably has some disability claim already lined up. The idea stuck because it made sense in the cynical way that military gossip usually did. Rebecca Martinez wasn't just underqualified. She was gaming the system for an honorable exit, collecting a paycheck while she documented injuries that would guarantee her a comfortable retirement. But Rebecca never reacted to any of it. She continued her nightly routine with the green notebook, writing with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else while conversations died awkwardly around her bunk. When someone finally worked up the courage to ask what she was documenting, she answered in the same flat tone she used for everything: inventory logs. It sounded exactly like what you'd expect from someone whose idea of military service involved counting supplies and filing reports. Nobody pressed for details, because honestly, who cared what kind of paperwork occupied her evenings? The real question was how long command would tolerate her presence before admitting the obvious mistake and reassigning her to somewhere more appropriate. The navigation exercise on day 22 was designed specifically to break people who'd been getting too comfortable with the routine. 5 waypoints scattered across a 3-mile course, hidden in terrain that looked identical in every direction, with only a topographic map and a compass that had been deliberately damaged to make the task more interesting. Snow had started falling. During the morning briefing, the kind of wet, heavy flakes that soaked through everything and turned the landscape into a monotone painting where landmarks disappeared and distances became impossible to judge accurately. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 meters, and the temperature was falling fast enough that exposed skin started going numb within minutes of leaving the warming huts. Most candidates moved quickly, trusting instincts and hoping to find markers before weather conditions deteriorated further. But Rebecca took her time at the starting point, studying the map like it contained secrets written in a foreign language, checking her compass heading 3 times before taking a single step into the white void ahead. She was still out there when others had finished and returned to base, still methodically working through the course while everyone else stood around the warming fire, complaining about frostbite and equipment failures. When she finally appeared through the snow, her face was raw with windburn, and her hands shook uncontrollably from cold exposure. But she had all 5 markers correctly identified and labeled, each waypoint logged with the kind of precision that suggested she'd taken the exercise more seriously than everyone else combined. Nobody acknowledged this achievement because acknowledging anything positive about Rebecca felt like admitting they'd been wrong about something fundamental. "I probably got lost and stumbled into them by accident," Jackson muttered. But even he didn't sound entirely convinced anymore, because there was something about the way she moved through difficult terrain, something about the careful attention she paid to details everyone else ignored, that suggested maybe there was more to Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez than they'd been willing to see. But admitting that would mean admitting they'd spent 3 weeks mocking someone who might actually know what she was doing. And that was a conversation nobody was ready to have. The rumors started small, whispered conversations that died when Rebecca entered the room. "She's connected," someone suggested during chow. "Nobody gets to Ridgeline without serious qualifications. Maybe she's somebody's wife, working an angle we don't understand." Other theories emerged with the creativity that idle soldiers brought to unsolved mysteries. She was here to write a book about military training failures. That notebook she carried everywhere. It was documentation for some kind of expose that would embarrass the entire program. Or maybe she was working for internal affairs, investigating complaints about instructor conduct. One evening, Jackson found something that changed the conversation completely. Searching online databases that were technically restricted but practically accessible to anyone with decent computer skills, he located a partial military citation, buried in archives that most people never bothered to check. Staff Sergeant R. Martinez, Northern Iraq, 2004. He read aloud to the small group gathered around his laptop. The document was heavily redacted, but certain phrases were visible: extraordinary heroism under enemy fire, and actions above and beyond the call of duty. Has to be her father. Someone said immediately, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to consider. Or it's completely fake. Anyone can create documents like this. But the citation stayed pinned to the bulletin board for 3 days before mysteriously disappearing. Nobody saw who took it down, and Rebecca never commented on its brief appearance. She just continued her routine with the green notebook, writing with the same steady rhythm while conversations grew quieter around her bunk. If she'd seen the citation, she gave no indication. If she cared about the speculation, she showed no sign of concern. She simply kept showing up for training exercises, kept accepting whatever challenges the mountain threw at her, kept demonstrating the kind of persistence that was starting to make some people genuinely uncomfortable. Because persistence without obvious qualification suggested possibilities that didn't fit neatly into their understanding of how military hierarchies were supposed to work. If Rebecca Martinez had earned respect somewhere else, in some context, none of them understood, then maybe their assumptions about who deserved consideration had been wrong from the beginning. The stress evolution exercise was deliberately designed to simulate equipment failures under combat conditions. Candidates had to drag weighted dummies uphill while dealing with simulated radio malfunctions, weapon jams, and medical emergencies that required immediate decisions under pressure. Jackson went first, completing the course in 9 minutes with the kind of aggressive efficiency that impressed instructors and intimidated competitors. Others followed within a reasonable time spread, each performance evaluated against standards. That measured both speed and tactical decision-making under stress. When Rebecca's turn came, the challenge became immediately brutal. The incline was steep, the snow had turned to treacherous ice, and she ground forward one painful step at a time while carrying equipment that seemed designed to defeat her before she reached the halfway point. Halfway up, her knee buckled, and she went down hard, sliding backward and losing precious progress on a slope that didn't forgive mistakes. She got up, reset her grip on the dummy, and kept climbing with the kind of determination that looked less like strategy and more like stubbornness. 14 minutes total. 8 minutes behind Jackson's time, slow enough that several observers started making jokes about setting new records for futility. But what they'd witnessed hadn't felt like failure to the few people who'd been paying attention to more than just the stopwatch. General Ward had been watching from the tree line, positioned where most candidates wouldn't notice his presence unless they were specifically looking for observation posts. When an instructor approached to suggest cutting Rebecca from the program, Ward responded with just 2 words. Not yet. The words were delivered with the kind of finality that ended conversations before they could develop into arguments. The instructor stepped back like he'd been formally dismissed, and the rest of the training cadre suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere that required their immediate attention. But Ward remained where he was, watching the woman who just demonstrated something that couldn't be measured by performance, metrics, or captured on standard evaluation forms. Something that had to do with the refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier, smarter, and more merciful than continuing. Something that suggested maybe the real test wasn't about who could complete missions fastest, but about who would still be attempting completion when everyone else had given up and gone home. That night, the atmosphere in the barracks felt different. Quieter, more thoughtful. Even Jackson, who usually provided commentary for everything that happened during training, kept his observations to himself. The usual evening conversations died out earlier than normal, replaced by the kind of contemplative silence that meant people were processing information they didn't quite understand. Rebecca sat on her bunk with the green notebook, writing with the same steady rhythm she'd maintained since arrival. But this time, when Private Davis worked up enough courage to approach and ask what she was documenting, the answer carried more weight than usual. Things that matter, Rebecca said quietly, not looking up from the page. It wasn't much of an explanation, but somehow it felt like more information than she'd shared during the entire time they'd known her. And in the silence that followed her response, several people found themselves wondering what exactly Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez considered important enough to record in permanent ink. The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, lingering long after the conversation had moved on to other topics. Because if she was documenting things that mattered, and she'd been watching them for 3 weeks with the careful attention of someone conducting an evaluation, then maybe the real question wasn't whether she belonged at Ridgeline. Maybe the question was whether they were worthy of whatever lessons she might have come here to teach. The harassment escalated afterward, spread about General Ward's intervention. Instead of backing down, some candidates interpreted his protection as confirmation that Rebecca was receiving unfair special treatment. The jokes became sharper, more personal, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify their continued contempt. Someone started leaving combat manuals on her bunk with pages bookmarked at basic skills sections: how to tie boots properly, how to hold a rifle, elementary map reading techniques that any recruit should master in the first week of training. The message was clear. She needed remedial instruction in fundamentals that everyone else had mastered years ago. Jackson took particular pleasure in offering loudly stated helpful advice during group exercises. Martinez, the enemy is usually in front of you, not behind. He'd call out during tactical movements. Try to keep up with the rest of the team. We can't wait for stragglers in real combat situations. The constant commentary was designed to break her composure, to force some kind of emotional response that would confirm their assessment of her as fundamentally unsuited for serious military operations. But Rebecca absorbed it all with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else, never defending herself, never asking for intervention, never giving them the satisfaction of visible reaction. What they didn't realize was that every comment, every deliberate slight, every moment of calculated cruelty was being documented in the green notebook with the same methodical precision she brought to equipment inventories and navigation exercises. Not for revenge, but for understanding, a comprehensive record of how leadership failures manifested in group dynamics under stress. The breaking point came during a night movement exercise designed to test individual initiative under realistic combat conditions. Candidates were dropped at separate locations with orders to reach a designated rally point using only basic navigation equipment and personal judgment about route selection and timing. Rebecca was given coordinates that placed her starting position significantly farther from the objective than others received. A mistake that several instructors claimed was due to clerical error, but felt suspiciously deliberate to anyone paying attention to the pattern of subtle sabotage she'd been experiencing. She completed the movement successfully, arriving at the rally point within the designated time window, despite the extra distance and more difficult terrain. But when she reported to the checkpoint, her completion was disputed by Sergeant Williams, one of the instructors who'd made his disapproval of her presence increasingly obvious. "Martinez, you're missing required equipment," Williams announced, loudly enough for everyone to hear. Night vision device wasn't properly secured. That's an automatic failure for this exercise. Rebecca checked her gear systematically, the same way she approached every technical challenge. The night vision device was properly mounted and secured according to standard procedures. She pointed this out calmly, without defensiveness or accusation, simply stating the observable facts of her equipment status. "Don't argue with me, soldier," Williams snapped. "I know proper equipment security when I see it. You failed to maintain positive control of essential gear during movement. That's a safety violation that could get people killed in combat." It was a fabricated charge, and everyone present knew it. But challenging an instructor's evaluation required formal complaint procedures that could take weeks to resolve. And most candidates understood that making waves rarely improved their standing in competitive training programs. Rebecca stood at attention while Williams documented his fictitious safety violation, her expression never changing despite the obvious injustice of the situation. But something fundamental shifted in that moment, visible only to those who'd learned to read the subtle signs of her emotional state. She wasn't broken by the false accusation. She was taking notes, mentally recording not just the specific incident, but the broader pattern of behavior it represented. The abuse of authority, the willingness to falsify official records, the casual cruelty that some people displayed when they thought they could act without consequences. That night, she sat with her notebook longer than usual, writing with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was documenting something more significant than routine training observations. When Private Davis approached to ask if she was all right, Rebecca looked up with an expression that carried new determination. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "But some things can't continue the way they've been going." It wasn't a threat or a complaint. It was a statement of fact delivered with the same calm certainty she brought to navigation problems and equipment maintenance. But somehow it felt like the most significant thing she'd said since arriving at Ridgeline. Because for the first time, her voice carried the subtle authority of someone who'd made a decision about how to handle a situation that had gone beyond acceptable limits. Not with drama or confrontation, but with the kind of methodical approach that suggested she understood systems and procedures better than her. Critics had realized the next morning brought news that would reshape everything. General Ward's aide delivered word that all candidates would be assembled for a special presentation in the old command hall, a building that had been largely unused since their arrival and served mainly as storage for equipment too obsolete to deploy but too valuable to discard. The order came without explanation or context, just the kind of directive that meant someone important wanted to address them and didn't feel obligated to justify the interruption of normal training schedules. It was unusual enough to generate speculation, but not unprecedented in a program where unexpected evaluations and surprise inspections were part of the standard curriculum. Rebecca received the same notification as everyone else, but she responded to it with something that might have been anticipation rather than curiosity, as if she'd been expecting something like this to happen, as if recent events had been building toward a moment of clarification that was finally about to arrive. She packed her notebook carefully and checked her uniform with the same attention to detail she brought to everything else. But this time, her preparations felt different. Not like someone getting ready for another day of endurance and humiliation, but like someone preparing for a presentation she'd been quietly anticipating. When Private Davis asked if she knew what the assembly was about, Rebecca's answer was characteristically brief, but somehow more meaningful than usual. "I think it's time for some questions to get answered." The response carried implications that Davis didn't fully understand, but it felt significant enough that he made sure to position himself where he could observe Rebecca's reactions during whatever was about to unfold in the command hall, because something in her tone suggested that the answers they were about to receive might change everything they thought they knew about Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez and why she'd really been sent to Ridgeline. The old command hall stood at the edge of the main compound like a monument to an earlier era of military architecture. Built when Ridgeline had served a different purpose, it featured wood floors, high ceilings, and the kind of architectural details that spoke of permanence rather than the utilitarian efficiency that marked newer buildings. Most candidates had never been inside. There had been no reason to visit a structure that seemed to exist mainly as storage for equipment, too obsolete for current use, but too historically significant to dispose of. But tonight the hall was fully lit with warm air, spilling from heating vents that hadn't been active since their arrival. General Ward waited near the far wall, hands behind his back, dress uniform immaculate despite the mountain cold. Silver stars caught the overhead lights, just enough to remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with, but it wasn't his rank. That commanded immediate attention. It was the wall behind him. Black granite, polished to mirror brightness, stretched from floor to ceiling, covered with names etched in precise block letters. Not a memorial wall exactly, but something that felt more private, more personal, like a conversation that wasn't meant for public consumption. The names were arranged in columns, each followed by series of numbers and letters that looked like some kind of classification code. No dates, no unit designations, no context that would explain what connected these people or why their names deserved preservation in stone. Ward waited until the formation was complete before speaking, his voice carrying easily through the hall without being raised. Natural command presence that made everyone lean forward slightly to ensure they didn't miss anything important. Everyone wants to be remembered. He began, eyes moving across the group like he was taking inventory of something only he could see. But the people who really mattered, the ones who did things that will never make it into history books, they asked for something different. He gestured toward the wall behind him, where names waited in orderly columns like soldiers in eternal formation. Every person on this wall served in operations that officially never happened. Missions that don't exist in any database you'll ever access. Places that don't appear on maps you'll ever see. Fighting enemies that were never acknowledged by any government. A pause long enough for implications to settle. Someone in the back shifted nervously, the sound echoing off high ceilings like a gunshot in church. They didn't want recognition. They wanted protection for themselves, for their families, for the people they served with. This wall isn't about glory. It's about keeping secrets that still matter. Ward turned slightly, his gaze finding one particular name near the top of the wall. He pointed to it with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this before in other contexts, for other audiences who needed to understand what they were seeing. RM9317R, he read aloud, voice carrying no emotion, just facts as they appeared on stone. The silence that followed was complete. Not just quiet, but empty. Like the moment between lightning and thunder when the world holds its breath, waiting for impact. Private Davis was first to make the connection, his eyes moving from the wall to Rebecca, standing quietly at the edge of formation. "Those are her initials," he whispered, voice barely audible but somehow carrying clearly through the silence. Ward didn't confirm or deny the observation. He simply looked at the group with the expression of someone waiting for them to figure out something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The code after her initials represents classification levels that most of you don't have clearance to understand. He continued. Operations conducted in places that don't exist against targets that were never identified, using methods that have been redacted from every official record. Jackson felt something cold settle in his stomach as he looked at Rebecca, really. Looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived at Ridgeline. The quiet woman who'd endured 3 weeks of mockery and casual cruelty without complaint or explanation. "She didn't come here to prove herself to you," Ward said, voice cutting through growing understanding like a blade through silk. "She came here to teach you something about what real service looks like." He let that settle for a moment before continuing, each word chosen with surgical precision. "You've been testing her for 3 weeks, measuring her performance against standards that don't apply to someone with her background. Wondering why she's here, why she doesn't quit, why she keeps showing up despite consistent failure." His eyes moved across the formation, finding each face in turn. "She's here because the military is changing. Because the lessons she learned in places you've never heard of are being forgotten in favor of newer theories and cleaner methods, and someone decided those lessons needed to be preserved." Ward turned back to the wall, his hand nearly touching the granite surface. She's not here to compete with you. She's here to make sure that when you lead units into impossible situations, you remember what it means to refuse to quit. Even when quitting would be easier. Even when continuing looks like failure to everyone watching. The hall was completely silent now, the kind of quiet that felt heavy with implications nobody was quite ready to process. "Tomorrow," Ward said, turning back to face them, "she takes point. You follow her lead. And maybe, if you pay attention, you'll learn something about what it means to serve when nobody's keeping score." The formation broke up slowly, people filing out in small groups that were unusually quiet for soldiers who just received new information about their situation. But the conversations that should have followed never materialized, because nobody was quite sure what they'd just learned or what it meant for everything they thought they knew about Staff Sergeant Rebecca. Martinez died in the barracks that night. Usual evening chatter was replaced by thoughtful silence. People went through their routines without the casual commentary that normally marked the end of another training day. And more than one person found themselves looking at Rebecca's bunk with something approaching respect rather than contempt. She sat in her usual position with the green notebook, writing with the same methodical precision she'd maintained since arrival. But now her presence felt different. Not like someone who didn't belong, but like someone who belonged in ways they were just beginning to understand. When Private Davis finally worked up courage to approach her bunk, Rebecca looked up with the same calm expression she brought to everything else. "Staff Sergeant," Davis said quietly, "that notebook you're always writing in ... Rebecca closed the cover gently, finger marking the place where she'd stopped. "Inventory," she said, the same answer she'd given before. But this time, Davis pressed a little harder. "Inventory of what?" For a long moment, Rebecca didn't respond. Then she opened the notebook to a page covered with neat columns of numbers and letters, organized with the kind of precision that suggested official documentation rather than personal reflection. "Equipment discrepancies," she said quietly. "Safety. Violations. Training gaps. Things that could get people killed if they're not addressed." Davis looked at the page, seeing what appeared to be comprehensive audit of everything they'd encountered during their time at Ridgeline. Every piece of equipment, every procedure, every detail that had seemed insignificant when they were focusing on individual performance. "You've been watching us," Davis said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I've been learning," Rebecca replied. "That's why I'm here. The tests you've been watching me fail? Those aren't the tests that matter. The test that matters is whether I can identify what needs to be fixed before someone gets hurt." The next morning brought a clarity that only comes after nights of serious thinking. Usual breakfast conversations were replaced by something approaching respectful silence. When Rebecca entered the mess hall, the typical jokes and whispered comments were conspicuously absent. She moved through the serving line with the same efficient movements she'd always used. But this time, when she looked for a place to sit, Private Davis gestured toward an empty chair at his table. "Staff Sergeant," Davis said formally. "Would you like to join us?" It was a small gesture, but in the context of 3 weeks of social isolation, it felt significant. Rebecca nodded once and sat down, her posture as straight and controlled as always. "Question," Jackson said after a moment of silence. He was sitting across from her, his usual cockiness replaced by something that looked like genuine curiosity. "That citation we found online, the Silver Star from Iraq, was that actually yours?" Rebecca took a sip of coffee, considering the question with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. "Classifications exist for good reasons," she said finally. "Some stories aren't meant to be shared until the people involved are no longer in danger." It wasn't exactly an answer, but it felt like as much confirmation as they were likely to get. "But you were there," Davis said. "In Iraq, in combat. I was in a lot of places, Rebecca replied. Did a lot of things. Most of them don't make good. Conversation topics. She looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. The important thing isn't where I've been. It's what I learned while I was there, and whether any of you are interested in learning it too. Jackson leaned forward slightly. What kind of things? How to keep functioning when everything goes wrong. How to make decisions when all the options are bad. How to lead people through situations that aren't covered in any manual. She paused, her expression serious but not unkind. How to be the person who doesn't quit, even when quitting looks like the smart move to everyone watching. The conversation continued through breakfast and into the morning briefing, where the usual dynamic had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Instructors seemed more careful in their comments, more aware that they were dealing with something beyond the normal parameters of their training program. When General Ward announced that Staff Sergeant Martinez would be taking point for the day's exercise, nobody complained or questioned the decision. They just fell into formation behind her and waited to see what 3 weeks of underestimation had cost them. The morning exercise was different from anything they'd attempted before. Instead of individual performance metrics or team competitions, Ward had designed something that required collective problem solving. Under pressure, a simulated search and rescue operation in terrain that offered multiple approaches and obviously, correct solutions. Rebecca stood at the head of formation, map in hand, studying the problem with the same methodical attention she brought to every other challenge at Ridgeline. But this time, when she spoke, everyone listened. The direct route is obvious, she said, pointing to what appeared to be the most efficient path to the objective. It's also a killing field if we're dealing with hostile observation. The indirect approaches take longer, but offer better concealment and multiple exit strategies. Jackson, who would normally have argued for the aggressive approach, found himself nodding. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we use the terrain instead of fighting it, Rebecca replied. Move in overwatch pairs, maintain communication discipline, and assume someone is watching even when we can't see them. It was a conversation, not a lecture. She was sharing expertise rather than imposing authority, drawing from experience that had been earned in places where mistakes carried consequences. Beyond training evaluations, the operation itself unfolded with precision that surprised everyone, including instructors who were monitoring from observation posts scattered throughout the area. Instead of the usual chaos that marked complex exercises, Rebecca's team moved with coordinated efficiency, each person understanding their role and executing it, without drama or confusion. When they reached the objective, a simulated casualty, requiring extraction from difficult terrain, the process was smooth and professional. No wasted motion, no competing egos, just the kind of collective competence that usually took months to develop. How did you know that would work? Davis asked as they secured the casualty for transport. Because I've extracted real people from real situations, Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. And the principles don't change just because the stakes are lower. The debrief afterward was unlike any they'd experienced at Ridgeline. Instead of individual critiques and performance rankings, Ward focused on collective lessons and systemic improvements. He praised decision-making over speed, communication over individual heroics, and sustainable performance over spectacular efforts that couldn't be maintained under stress. This is what good leadership looks like, he told them, his eyes finding Rebecca at the edge of the group. Not the person who runs fastest or carries the most weight. The person who brings everyone home. As the group dispersed, several people approached Rebecca with questions about techniques she'd used, decisions she'd made, observations about terrain and tactics that had escaped their notice. For the first time since arriving at Ridgeline, she was being treated as a source of knowledge rather than an object of amusement. Staff Sergeant, Corporal Anderson said as she was packing her gear, I owe you an apology. We all do. Rebecca looked up, considering the offer with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. Apologies are nice, she said finally. But what I'd really like is for you to remember this feeling the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations. She shouldered her pack and started walking toward the barracks. Because the world is full of people who know things you don't know. And you never learn from them if you spend all your time proving how much smarter you think you are. That evening, as the sun set behind mountain peaks and temperature began its nightly drop toward freezing, Rebecca sat outside the barracks with her green notebook. But this time, she wasn't alone. Davis had brought his own notebook, along with questions about everything they'd experienced during the day's exercise. Jackson joined them. Then Anderson, then several others who'd realized they had more to learn than they'd originally thought. Question, Jackson said, as they reviewed the day's route on a tactical map. How do you know when someone is really qualified for something? Like this? Like, what should we be looking for in ourselves and each other? Rebecca considered the question while making notes in the margin of her map. Watch how people react when things don't go according to plan, she said. Anyone can perform when conditions are perfect. The real test is what happens when everything goes wrong and you have to keep functioning anyway. She looked around the small group, her expression serious but encouraging. Also, watch how they treat people who can't help them. The way someone behaves toward people they don't need is usually a good indicator of their character. The conversation continued as stars came out, ranging across topics that weren't covered in any training manual, but seemed essential for understanding what military service really meant. Not just technical skills or physical requirements, but deeper questions about leadership, responsibility, and what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. For the first time since arriving at Camp Ridgeline, the questions felt more important than the answers, because they were finally asking them of someone who had earned the right to respond. Word of Rebecca's true background spread through Ridgeline like wildfire, but instead of bringing immediate consequences for her tormentors, it created an uncomfortable tension that hung over every interaction. The same people who'd spent 3 weeks mocking her competence now had to confront the reality that they'd been bullying a decorated combat veteran whose service record was classified at levels they couldn't even access. Sergeant Williams, who had fabricated the equipment violation during the night movement exercise, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His false official report was still on record, documented in systems that General Ward and his staff had full access. To review, what had seemed like a harmless power play designed to humiliate an underperforming candidate was now revealed as falsification of official documents regarding a soldier whose actual qualifications dwarfed his own. The investigation began quietly, the way military justice often does when higher command wants to understand exactly what happened before deciding how to respond. Ward's staff conducted interviews with every candidate who'd witnessed the incident, comparing testimonies and reviewing equipment logs to establish the factual record. Rebecca was called in first, not as a complainant but as a witness to her own treatment. She sat across from Ward's aide, a lieutenant colonel whose expression remained carefully neutral as she walked through the timeline of events leading up to the falsified violation. Did you at any point lose positive control of required equipment during the movement exercise? The aide asked. No, sir. All equipment remained properly secured throughout the operation. Did you at any point request special consideration or accommodation for the longer route you were assigned? No, sir. I completed the movement as directed using the starting coordinates I was given. Did you file a complaint about Sergeant Williams's evaluation of your performance? Rebecca paused, considering the question carefully. I documented the incident in my training log, as I do with all significant events, but I didn't pursue formal complaint procedures. Why not? For the first time during the interview, Rebecca's expression showed something that might have been slight amusement. Because I knew the truth would come out eventually. It always does. The investigation expanded to include a comprehensive review of her treatment since arriving at Ridgeline. The sticky notes on her locker, the deliberate exclusion from informal groups, the constant commentary designed to undermine her confidence. All of it documented in witness statements that painted a picture of systematic harassment that had gone unchecked for weeks. Jackson was called in on the third day, his previous confidence replaced by the kind of nervous energy that comes from realizing you might have made career-ending mistakes. The aide's questions were direct and unforgiving. Private Jackson, did you refer to Staff Sergeant Martinez as the supply lady on her first day at Ridgeline? Yes, sir. But I didn't know. Did you create and distribute the nickname clipboard to refer to Staff Sergeant Martinez? Jackson's throat felt dry. Yes, sir. Did you suggest that Staff Sergeant Martinez was faking injuries to obtain a medical discharge? The questions continued methodically, building a comprehensive record of behavior that looked increasingly indefensible when stripped of context and laid out as bare facts. What had felt like harmless ribbing among peers was revealed as systematic harassment of a superior officer whose service record included operations that Jackson would never be qualified to understand. But the real reckoning came when General Ward called an assembly to address what his investigation had uncovered. This time, they gathered in the main briefing room rather than the ceremonial command hall. The atmosphere was tense, everyone understanding that consequences were about to be delivered, but uncertain about their scope or severity. Ward stood at the front of the room, his expression carrying the kind of controlled anger that was more intimidating than shouting. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly to every corner of the room. In 3 weeks of observation, I've watched some of you demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership failures that get people killed in combat, he began. Not because you lack technical skills or physical capability, but because you lack the judgment to recognize competence when it doesn't match your preconceptions. He looked directly at Jackson, who seemed to shrink in his seat under the scrutiny. Private Jackson, you spent 3 weeks mocking a soldier whose classified service record includes more combat experience than the rest of this room combined. You created a hostile environment based on assumptions that were not only wrong, but dangerously arrogant. Jackson started to respond, but Ward's raised hand cut him off immediately. Sergeant Williams, you falsified an official report to support your personal bias against a soldier whose qualifications to be here exceed your own by orders of magnitude. That's not just poor judgment. It's a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That could result in court-martial proceedings. The silence in the room was absolute. Every person present understood they were witnessing career-defining moments for several of their colleagues. But here's what concerns me most, Ward continued, his gaze moving across the entire group. None of you questioned the treatment Staff Sergeant Martinez was receiving. You either participated in it or stood by and watched it happen. That tells me something about your fitness for leadership that no training exercise could reveal. He gestured toward Rebecca, who sat quietly in the front row, her expression as calm and controlled as always. This officer volunteered to come, here knowing she would face exactly this kind of treatment. She endured weeks of harassment and deliberate sabotage as part of an evaluation that wasn't about her capabilities. It was about yours. About whether you could recognize leadership when it didn't come in the package you expected. The implications hit the room like a physical force. Rebecca hadn't been struggling to meet their standards. She'd been testing their character while appearing to fail by conventional metrics. Staff Sergeant Martinez's mission here was to identify systemic problems in how we evaluate and develop military leaders, Ward explained. Her performance in traditional exercises was deliberately mediocre to create the conditions necessary for you to reveal your true attitudes towards service members who don't fit standard profiles. Jackson felt sick as understanding dawned. Every joke, every dismissive comment, every moment of casual cruelty had been observed and documented by someone whose job was to evaluate their fitness for leadership positions. The notebook she's been writing in? It contains a comprehensive assessment of each of you, focusing not on your physical performance, but on your character under stress. How you treat people you perceive as weak. How you respond to authority. How you handle frustration and uncertainty. Ward paused, letting the weight of that revelation settle. Some of you passed that evaluation. You showed dignity, offered support, or at minimum, refrain from participating in harassment. Your names will be forwarded for advanced leadership training opportunities. Relief flickered across several faces, but Ward's expression made it clear. He wasn't finished. Others of you failed catastrophically. You demonstrated exactly the kind of character flaws that make officers dangerous to their own troops. Private Jackson, Sergeant Williams, your participation in this program is terminated effective immediately. You'll be transferred to units where your leadership potential can be reassessed. The words hit like hammer blows. Jackson stared at Rebecca, understanding finally dawning that every moment of her apparent weakness had been a test he'd failed completely. Corporal Anderson, Private Davis, you showed potential for growth. You'll remain in the program, but under enhanced evaluation. Your future here depends on demonstrating that you can learn from this experience. Ward's voice softened slightly as he addressed the remaining candidates. The rest of you have shown that you understand military service is about more than individual achievement. You recognize that dignity and respect are earned through character, not just performance metrics. You'll continue with advanced training starting tomorrow. As the assembly broke up, Jackson approached Rebecca with something between desperation and genuine remorse. Staff Sergeant, I need you to know that I'm sorry. Really sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand. Now, Rebecca looked at him with the same calm assessment she'd shown throughout her time at Ridgeline. Private Jackson, she said quietly, the apology I need isn't for me. It's for the next person you meet who doesn't fit your expectations. The question is whether you've learned enough to treat them with the respect you failed to show me. Jackson nodded, understanding that his military career would be defined by whether he could demonstrate that growth in whatever assignment awaited him. As Rebecca gathered her notebook and prepared to transition to her new role as an official instructor, she reflected on the success of an operation that had cost her 3 weeks of dignity but had revealed truths about leadership that couldn't be taught through conventional methods. The mountain had tested them all. But the most important tests had nothing to do with physical endurance or tactical knowledge. They had been about character, integrity, and the wisdom to recognize that strength comes in many forms. 2 days later, Rebecca stood before the remaining candidates in her new capacity as senior instructor for advanced leadership development. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the uncertain figure who'd struggled through basic exercises, replaced by someone whose authority was unmistakable and whose presence commanded immediate respect. Before we begin advanced training, she said, her voice carrying the kind of natural command that couldn't be faked, I want to address what happened here and why it was necessary. She gestured toward the tactical maps and training schedules posted around the room, but her focus remained on the faces of the soldiers who'd survived the unexpected evaluation of their character. Military leadership isn't about being the fastest, strongest, or most technically proficient person in your unit. It's about making good decisions when all the information is incomplete and all the options are bad. It's about earning trust from people who have every reason to doubt you. And most importantly, It's about recognizing capability wherever you find it, even when it doesn't match your preconceptions. Private Davis raised his hand hesitantly. Staff Sergeant, how long have you been conducting evaluations like this? 8 years, Rebecca replied. I've been to 17 different training facilities, assessing everything from basic leadership courses to special operations selection programs. The problems are remarkably consistent across all levels. She moved to a whiteboard and began writing a list that captured the most common failures she'd observed. Assumption that physical performance equals leadership potential. Inability to recognize expertise that doesn't advertise itself. Confusion between confidence and competence. Tolerance for bullying behavior that undermines unit cohesion. Corporal Anderson studied the list with growing understanding. These are all things that would get people killed in actual combat situations. Exactly. Rebecca confirmed. A leader who can't identify the quiet expert in their unit will miss critical information when it matters most. A leader who confuses arrogance with ability will make tactical decisions based on ego rather than reality. A leader who tolerates harassment creates an environment where people won't speak up about problems until it's too late. She turned back to face the group, her expression serious but encouraging. The candidates who passed this evaluation didn't necessarily perform better on traditional metrics, but they showed the kind of judgment and character that suggests they can be trusted with responsibility for other people's lives. The training that followed was unlike anything they'd experienced before. Instead of focusing on individual performance, Rebecca designed exercises that revealed how people thought under pressure, how they processed incomplete information, and how they treated team members who struggled with specific challenges. During a complex navigation exercise, she deliberately assigned role rotations that put each person in positions where they had to rely on others' expertise. The soldier who excelled at map reading had to trust someone else's compass work. The candidate with the best physical conditioning had to depend on others for tactical decision-making. Leadership is about building systems where everyone's strengths contribute to collective success, she explained during the debrief. If your leadership style requires you to be the smartest person in the room about everything, you're not leading. You're performing. Private Brooks, one of the quieter candidates who'd consistently shown good judgment throughout the evaluation, asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Staff Sergeant, that classified service record General Ward mentioned. Can you tell us anything about what you actually did before coming here? Rebecca considered the question carefully, weighing classification requirements against the educational value of sharing appropriate details. I can tell you that I spent 12 years in units that operated in places where conventional leadership models didn't apply, she said finally. Small teams, high-stakes missions, environments where every decision had immediate consequences for mission success and team survival. She gestured toward the mountain peaks visible through the window, their snow-covered summits catching afternoon sunlight. The skills that mattered most weren't the ones that looked impressive during training. They were things like reading people accurately, adapting quickly to changing situations, and maintaining team cohesion when everything went wrong. Those are the skills this program is designed to develop. The conversation continued through dinner and into evening study periods, as Rebecca shared carefully selected experiences that illustrated principles of leadership under extreme stress. Not war stories designed to impress, but case studies that demonstrated how theoretical concepts applied in real-world situations where mistakes carried permanent consequences. Question, Davis said, as they reviewed tactical decision-making scenarios. How do you develop the confidence to make hard decisions when you're not sure you're right? You accept that uncertainty is permanent, Rebecca replied. Perfect information doesn't exist in combat, and it doesn't exist in leadership generally. Your job isn't to be right all the time. It's to make the best decision possible with available information, then adapt when new information changes the situation. She pointed to a map showing multiple route options for a hypothetical mission. Every choice involves trade-offs. Faster routes might be more dangerous. Safer approaches might take too long. Your job as a leader is to understand those trade-offs clearly and make decisions that your team can execute successfully, even if they're not theoretically optimal. Anderson nodded slowly. That's why you chose the indirect approach during yesterday's exercise. Not because it was faster, but because it was sustainable for the entire team. Right. And notice that we completed the mission with everyone intact and mission ready for follow-on operations. That's what success looks like in leadership, not individual heroics, but collective capability that can be maintained over time. As the evening progressed, Rebecca introduced concepts that weren't covered in standard leadership curricula, but proved essential in real-world applications. How to recognize when someone was struggling without making them feel singled out. How to delegate effectively without abandoning responsibility. How to maintain morale during extended operations where progress wasn't immediately visible. The hardest part of leadership, she said as the session wound down, is accepting that your primary job is to develop other people's capabilities, not to demonstrate your own. That requires a kind of humility that doesn't always come naturally. To people who've succeeded through individual achievement. She looked around the room at the faces of soldiers who were beginning to understand that everything they'd thought they knew about military leadership was incomplete. Tomorrow we start practical application. You'll rotate through leadership positions during complex scenarios designed to test your judgment under pressure. The goal isn't to find the one right answer. It's to develop your ability to make good decisions quickly and adapt when circumstances change. As the group dispersed, several candidates approached Rebecca with additional questions about specific aspects of leadership development. For the first time since her arrival at Ridgeline, these conversations felt like professional development rather than interrogation. But the most significant moment came when Corporal Anderson pulled her aside as others were leaving. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something that's been bothering me. During those 3 weeks when I was treating you badly, it had hurt. I mean, on a personal level?" Rebecca studied his face, recognizing genuine concern rather than casual curiosity. "It hurt," she said simply. "But it also taught me things about resilience and dignity that I couldn't have learned any other way. And it gave me information about each of you that will make me a better instructor going forward." She smiled slightly, the first time most of them had seen her expression soften. The question isn't whether difficult experiences hurt. The question is whether you learn from them in ways that make you more capable of helping other people. That's what leadership really means, using your experience, including the painful parts, to create better outcomes for the people who depend on you. Anderson nodded, understanding that he'd just received a lesson in leadership that couldn't be found in any manual or regulation. As Rebecca prepared for the next phase of training, she reflected on the success of an operation that had achieved its objectives while revealing truths about military leadership that needed to be preserved and passed on to the next generation of officers. The mountain had tested them all, but the most important lessons had been about character, humility, and the wisdom to recognize that true strength often comes disguised as apparent weakness. 6 months later, Camp Ridgeline hosted a graduation ceremony for the most successful leadership development class in the program's history. General Ward stood before an assembly of officers, instructors, and family members who'd come to witness the transformation of candidates who'd survived one of the military's most challenging evaluations. Rebecca, now permanently assigned as Director of Advanced Leadership Assessment, watched from the platform as the graduates received their certifications. These weren't just completion certificates. They were endorsements for command positions that carried real responsibility for other people's lives and mission success. Private Davis, now Corporal Davis, received recognition for exceptional growth in tactical decision-making under pressure. His evaluation noted specifically his ability to recognize and incorporate expertise from team members whose capabilities weren't immediately obvious. Corporal Anderson was promoted to sergeant and assigned to instructor duty at the Army's premier leadership school. His recommendation emphasized his development of the humility and judgment necessary to train other leaders effectively, but the most remarkable transformation belonged to someone who wasn't present at the ceremony. Jackson had requested permission to address the graduating class via recorded message from his new assignment at a logistics base in Georgia. His face appeared on the main screen, showing someone who looked older and more thoughtful than the cocky soldier who'd arrived at Ridgeline months earlier. "I want to talk to you about failure," his recorded image said. "Not the kind of failure that ends your career, but the kind that teaches you who you really are when nobody's watching." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I failed the most important test I've ever taken. Not because I couldn't climb mountains or carry heavy equipment, but because I couldn't recognize competence when it didn't match my expectations. I let arrogance and prejudice turn me into exactly the kind of leader who gets people killed through stupidity and ego." The audience listened intently, understanding they were hearing a confession that carried real weight. Staff Sergeant Martinez gave me something more valuable than passing grades or positive evaluations. She gave me the opportunity to see myself clearly, to understand what kind of person I've become and what kind of leader I never want to be. Jackson's expression grew more serious. "My new assignment isn't glamorous. I'm managing supply chains and coordinating logistics for units that do the kind of work I thought I wanted to do. But I'm learning something important. Every job in the military matters, and the people doing unglamorous work often understand things that the people in high-profile positions miss completely." He looked directly into the camera, as if addressing each graduate personally. "Don't make my mistake. Don't confuse confidence with competence. Don't assume that the quiet person in the back doesn't have something important to teach you. And don't ever think that your job is to prove how tough you are instead of figuring out how to help everyone around you succeed." The message ended with Jackson in his new role, working alongside soldiers whose expertise in logistics and supply management kept combat units functioning effectively. It was honest documentation of someone who'd found purpose and dignity in service that didn't match his original ambitions, but suited his actual capabilities. As the ceremony continued, General Ward delivered remarks that captured the significance of what they'd accomplished at Ridgeline. "Military leadership has always been about more than individual achievement," he said. "But in an era of complex operations and diverse teams, the ability to recognize and develop talent wherever you find it has become essential for mission success." He gestured toward Rebecca, whose contribution to the program had transformed their approach to leadership development. "Staff Sergeant Martinez has developed evaluation methods that identify character traits we've always needed but rarely tested for systematically. Her work here will be replicated at training facilities throughout the military, ensuring that future leaders understand that strength comes in many forms." The ceremony concluded with the traditional challenge coin presentation, but this time, the coins carried special significance. Each was engraved with coordinates that corresponded to the location where the recipient had demonstrated growth and leadership under pressure. Not their moment of greatest technical achievement, but their moment of greatest character development. Afterward, as families and friends mingled during the reception, Rebecca found herself in conversation with General Ward about the future of leadership assessment programs. "The methods you've developed here are already being implemented at other installations," Ward told her. We're seeing remarkable improvements in the quality of officers being selected for command positions." Rebecca nodded, but her attention was focused on the graduates who were sharing their experiences with family members, explaining how their understanding of leadership had evolved during their time at Ridgeline. "The real test will be how they perform when they're responsible for other people," she said. "Whether they remember these lessons when they're under stress and making decisions that affect their subordinates' lives." Ward followed her gaze to where Sergeant Anderson was explaining to his parents why his assignment to instructor duty represented the kind of opportunity he'd never appreciated before coming to Ridgeline. "I think they'll remember," Ward said, "because the lessons weren't theoretical. They experienced firsthand what happens when leadership fails, and they've seen what good leadership looks like under pressure." As the reception wound down, Rebecca stepped outside to enjoy the mountain air and reflect on the success of a program that had achieved objectives beyond what anyone had originally imagined. Corporal Davis approached as she was reviewing her notes from the ceremony. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "I wanted to thank you for something that goes beyond the professional development." Rebecca looked up, curious about what he wanted to express. "You taught us that dignity isn't something you perform for other people. It's something you maintain for yourself, regardless of how others treat you. That lesson is going to matter for the rest of my career, and probably for the rest of my life." She smiled, understanding that he'd grasped one of the most important principles that couldn't be taught directly, but had to be demonstrated through example. "Corporal Davis," she replied, "the fact that you recognize that lesson means you're ready for the responsibility that comes with leadership. Remember that when you're working with soldiers who don't fit standard expectations." As the evening ended and the mountain grew quiet, Rebecca sat in her office updating files that would inform the next phase of leadership development programs. A green notebook had evolved into a comprehensive database of assessment techniques that could identify character traits essential for military leadership. But the most important outcome wasn't captured in any official documentation. It was the knowledge that a new generation of military leaders understood that true strength often comes disguised as apparent weakness, that competence doesn't always advertise itself, and that the most dangerous enemies of good leadership are arrogance and the inability to recognize talent wherever it appears. The wall in the old command hall had gained new meaning during their time at Ridgeline. It wasn't just a memorial to classified service. It was a reminder that the most important contributions to military effectiveness often go unrecognized by conventional metrics. Rebecca's name would remain on that wall, representing not just her classified service record, but her contribution to developing leaders who understood that service meant something deeper than individual achievement. Leaders who would recognize and develop capability in others, regardless of whether it matched their preconceptions. As she prepared to transition to her next assignment, developing similar programs at other training facilities, Rebecca reflected on the success of an operation that had transformed understanding of military leadership assessment. The mountain had tested them all, but the most important lessons had been about character, humility, and the wisdom to understand that the strongest teams are built by leaders who know how to recognize and develop strength in others. The quiet woman who'd arrived at Ridgeline, appearing to fail at everything, had succeeded in the most important mission of all, ensuring that future military leaders would understand the difference between performing strength and actually possessing it. And in barracks around the world, soldiers who'd learned these lessons would carry them forward, creating better outcomes for the people who depended on them, and honoring the legacy of someone who taught them that true leadership means helping others succeed, regardless of whether anyone recognizes your contribution. The mountain remembered everything. But more importantly, the people who'd learned its lessons would ensure that the knowledge lived on, passed from one generation of leaders to the next. making the military stronger through wisdom rather than just tradition. Rebecca closed her notebook and prepared for tomorrow's challenges, knowing that the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with character, and won not through individual heroics, but through the patient work of developing others to be better than they thought possible. The legacy of respect she'd built at Ridgeline would continue long after her departure, carried forward by leaders who understood that strength comes in many forms, and that the quiet competence of overlooked individuals often contains the PDOs, wisdom that saves lives and completes missions when everything else fails. In the end, that was the lesson the mountain had been trying to teach all along, that true strength doesn't announce itself, but reveals itself through service to something greater than personal ambition. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.